Hello, my name is Kyler Sumter. I'm the Chicago Media Assistant at NRDC, and I'm excited to be joined here today by Yesenia Balcazar, who is the Senior Resilient Community Planning Manager of Southeast Environmental Task Force, and Courtney Hansen, who's the Deputy Director of People for Community Recovery. So we're here today to talk about building decarbonization, what it is and why it's important for environmental justice communities. And I'm excited to have Yesenia and Courtney here because they've been doing a lot of great work on this in Chicago. So thank you both for joining.
Thanks for having us.
Of course.
Thank you so much.
So first question, from both of your perspectives, can you talk about why making our buildings cleaner and more efficient is important for environmental justice communities? Whoever wants to go first.
I'm currently unmuted, so I guess I'll start. I think for me, the importance of it really is, and you know, the second question gets into it deeper in terms of what the two policies are. One deals with new construction, so completely new buildings, and the other deals with a building performance standard. So really, I think the focus in terms of EJ and marginalized communities would be with a building performance standard, because that has to deal more with the buildings that already exist. You know, a lot of the times in marginalized communities, we're not seeing a whole lot of new developments. We're not seeing, you know, buildings that get all this new tech, or, you know, that get the label of being like a clean building or net zero, things of that nature. So since, and even with a BPS in itself, because it's still so focused on emissions, I feel like the justice component actually comes from the streamlining that this sort of introduction of these policies brings about, right? So it creates a conversation around the issues that actually do impact marginalized communities in terms of their existing buildings, right? Public health issues, things like poor ventilation, mold, even times still lead in the paint, right? Things of that nature. So I think it's more about, maybe even has less to do with like the policies themselves, but the conversations that emerge as a result of the introduction of these policies. But that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I think that's right. Excuse me. And every community is different. Every EJ community is different, but the communities we work in on the far south side are really concerned about jobs and economic development, which would be impacted by these policies. There's a huge opportunity to build out workforce training programs and get agreements that ensure local hiring, which is really big. Yesenia mentioned the health piece, which is another big one. EJ communities tend to have higher asthma rates, higher rates of other respiratory illnesses, and removing gas from buildings is a huge way to improve indoor air quality and improve some of those health outcomes. And then the other big piece that we hear a lot about is affordability. We know there's a huge affordability crisis right now when it comes to gas prices. And as we go into the colder months, that's going to get worse. And so building decarbonization policies can really help with that affordability piece if they're done right.
Thank you both so much for sharing. And you already touched on this a little bit, but I'll go back to you first, Courtney. If you could explain more about what building decarbonization policies seek to do and why they are so important.
Sure. So essentially, this kind of broad movement that we're seeing towards building decarbonization is designed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from buildings. So here in Chicago, the city's climate action plan said that 69% of the city's emissions come from our buildings. And so these policies, first and foremost, seek to reduce those emissions, predominantly by switching from gas infrastructure to electric infrastructure. So getting away from gas and propane heating and clothes drying and stoves towards all electric. And so the way you do this is by addressing kind of permitting and what's allowed in new construction buildings, and then creating a pathway to sort of rehab existing buildings so that they have the correct infrastructure.
Yesenia, do you have anything to add to that? Thank you for that, Courtney.
Not too much. I always think that Courtney articulates it so well when describing them, because they are really technical and robust in nature. But I will say just that, like, kind of a key difference, or, you know, there's obviously like a duality with the two policies. But I think also what's helpful in like describing them is really differentiating that new construction versus like BPS or building performance standard, and how ultimately, again, thinking of it in like simple categorical terms or a simple categorical way, is really, in thinking like building performance standards has to do with a lot more of like the marginalized communities and how it would affect those, and new construction would pertain to a lot of, you know, a lot of the beautiful development that we see occur in downtown, and that obviously is advancing at a much more rapid pace than we are in the south and west sides, right?
Yeah, and I should say, even though these policies are predominantly designed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and that's what we're seeing, that doesn't have to be the whole story. And the work that we're doing in Chicago is to make sure that it's not the whole story. The reason that we care about these policies is because they can really help our communities who are hit first and worst by the impacts of climate change, and who, quite frankly, have a lot more pressing priorities. And so if they can help with energy burden and local jobs and health impacts, that's what folks actually care about. And we can design them to do that. And the way that we make sure that happens is by bringing community leaders together and getting them at the table, not only to design the policy, but also to resource them to help with the implementation, because that's where we know the change actually happens or doesn't happen. And so we need folks who know what they're doing from their lived experience to be leading this. And that's, I think, the difference about what we might be able to do in Chicago versus kind of broad sweeping trends nationally.
Thank you for touching on that. I do think the community aspect is so important, bringing the experts and the leaders from the community from that lived experience. Now, whoever wants to answer this one, can you talk about how all this work is also climate action?
I can take that. So, I mean, like I said, this really is about reducing greenhouse gas emissions from buildings. I think as a movement, we've done a lot on transportation. Of course, we need to do more. We've done a lot in the energy sector. Of course, we need to do more, but buildings are the next big sector. And so reducing emissions from buildings is not optional if we're going to meet our climate goals. The question is really more about, can we do it in a way that's equitable, or is it just going to be checking an emissions box?
Yeah, I'm on that note. I think like the larger like explanation of it, right? It makes that clear connection. Of course, if buildings are causing the 69% of greenhouse gas emissions, well, it makes sense. Then we're going to transition into, you know, carbon zero buildings, right? That's what makes sense. But and Courtney's point hit on this really well, right? That aspect of transition, and you know, we use the term here in EJ spaces and these organizing spaces within community is right. We don't just want to see transition; we want to see just transition, so that marginalized communities don't get left out of climate action. Climate action has so many more facets than just reducing emissions, right? Especially if we're trying to make a just transition. It becomes about climate justice too at the same time. So again, becomes a public health issue. Expanding the number of jobs, right? Creating those opportunities like Courtney mentioned before. So while that connection, I'm like, oh, it's a climate action policies, or these policies are centered on climate action because like, 2 + 2 = 4, but there's so much more that goes into it, especially when you're considering all the different groups of people that are impacted by these policies. So.
Thank you both for sharing that. I think that element is so important as well, the just transition and making sure it's equitable and not just a transition from one energy source to the next. I'll go back to you on this last question, Yesenia, just because building decarbonization can be a very, confusing topic for people who aren't as familiar with it. So how do you explain this stuff to like your family, your friends, or just people you talk to who aren't working in this space?
That is a good question because it is hard to explain, especially I'm thinking about like my family specifically, right? Both my parents immigrated here, or migrated, I should say, to Chicago from Mexico. And so understanding like these policies or the work that, Courtney and I are involved in, I think the simplest way that I try to explain it, because I think a lot of people are familiar with the term like fossil fuels and the energy sources that we've relied on for such a long time. And, oh my God, I'm just thinking of the silly phrase, go green. That's just been like become so greenwashed at this point. But even in trying to like delineate from that, just so like, yeah, we're trying to move away from that, from those sources, right? And how do we do that? Like, in terms of building decarb specifically, where you're saying like, oh, well, we're tackling it through buildings. But then similarly, I think of like the people that I'm surrounded by, and after getting through that kind of very simple foundational explanation of it, then I like to say like, okay, but here's why we should care though. Like, here's how it's gonna affect us and the people that live in our neighborhood, our family, right? And so then of course they understand so much more the issues that we go through being in an EJ community, because we see it and we live it every day. So I think it's about stripping down like all the technicality and like complications of it, or even just the term building decarbonization is just like so much to take in, like at face value. Nobody knows what that is. But yeah, so long story short, I think that's like how just getting to those like relatability pieces after explaining the main gist.
What about for you, Courtney?
Ooh, it depends on who I'm talking to, but I agree with Yesenia, like focusing on the benefits is helpful, especially predictability and affordability of energy prices. The health one is really big for a lot of folks. And also just focusing on the big picture, like this is the direction that we're going. And it's gonna really help a lot of folks. And it's important. And, what doesn't work well, I have found by talking to some of my family, is I used to kind of like use shorthand of building electrification or just electrification. And there is a little bit more to it. It's also about weatherization and efficiency and solar readiness. And my stepmom is a huge cook, and my family is remodeling their kitchen for the first time, like since before I was born. And she's so excited to have a gas stove and was just horrified at the thought of like, oh, I can't have my gas stove that I've been waiting, years to have because it's so great for cooking. So I also try to mention that there's like new technology and electric stoves, and induction stoves are really cool in that part. And it's such a trivial piece of the puzzle, but I think, people, the way that we imagine these things is in how do they affect our day-to-day life, and if that's important to you, that's what you're going to think about. And so just helping people imagine all of the ways that these kind of policies could affect their day-to-day life, whether it's having like a really cool new induction stove that can even be disguised into your countertop, or having a utility bill that's much lower so you can afford other things or not have to make really hard trade-offs of what to prioritize in your budget. All of these things are important. Having good family supporting jobs in your community. So it's really about connecting it to how it's going to affect your day-to-day life. And again, not to like harp too much on this point, but this is why people who are kind of on the front lines need to be having these policy discussions, because Yesenia and I have both been in policy discussions where we've said, we have to tell people how this is going to really affect their day-to-day life. And if we don't have the answer, then this policy is not a good one. And so we've done a lot of work around that. And now we have a lot of answers to point to that have really influenced what we think needs to be in a strong building performance standard or new constructions permitting. And so I think that's a really huge step, and we have a lot more work to do and kind of working with the city to make that a reality. But those things would not have even been part of the discussion if community leaders were not kind of at the table and listened to and reached out to and educated. And if we weren't saying like, you should be leading this, we need to hear from you, we would have a lot weaker policy and a lot of missed opportunities, I think.
Thank you both for sharing. Just so grateful to hear that you guys and community members are at the table for this. That's so important to be there for this decision making. And yes, that's all the questions we have for this conversation, but we're very excited to have a part 2 where we're going to talk more about the Chicago building decarbonization policies that Yesenia and Courtney and so many other community members are working on right now. But thank you both so much for joining and breaking down this important topic.
Thank you. Looking forward to continuing the discussion.
Exciting stuff.